Who's our guest this time on The Learning Hack? All the guests. Come on in, we're having a party. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
We've had conversations on The Learning Hack across a really wide range of topics, but certain themes keep cropping up again and again. And due to the mix of people we have as guests, innovators, thought leaders, analysts, practitioners and more, those themes are bound to be significant, if only as an indication of what we're all thinking and talking about now. So following a suggestion from one of our guests, Giacomelli, we've done an analysis, and we're going to tell you now what is uppermost in the collective mind of the learning profession, as we give you our top 5 themes from the podcast. But first, a quick recap. How did we get where we are now? Fact me, Kate.
Hack facts.
Since its birth in September 2019, The Learning Hack has built a global listenership, achieving downloads in the tens of thousands in 78 countries around the world, and garnered laudatory feedback. In May of this year, a YouTube version was added. To date, it's featured 40 guests, 43% of them women. Room for improvement there.
We're working towards parity. And which episodes have the most views and listens, Kate?
Let me give you the top 5, John.
Yeah, but don't just tell them. Give it a bit of pizzazz, a bit of showbiz.
So here they are, guys and gals, your top 5 most popular episodes on the Learning Hack podcast. Coming in at number 5, AI is the new UI with Donald Clark. At 4, we're coming out of lockdown with the tall guy from Fossway, David Wilson. Holding down the number 3 slot, it's not Manhattan Transfer, it's Learning Transfer with Paul Matthews. Volleying in at number 2, it's Skateboarding, Zombie Ideas and Instructional Design with Leonard Houx, which only leaves the number 1 spot, the most listened to and viewed episode in the whole of recorded time on the Learning Hack podcast. How people really learn with Nick Shackleton-Jones.
Must be that effective context theory of his. It's pure box office gold. Now folks, in our quest to plumb the depths of learning's collective psyche, I'd like to introduce you to our head of themes, Jay Curtis. What can you tell us about the themes, Jay?
Well, there were quite a few of them, John, and it's been a lot of work to do the analysis.
And I hear you've used some pretty fancy analytical techniques to do that as well. One in particular also employed by the UK government this year as part of its track and trace scheme. Is that right?
A spreadsheet, yes.
Anything else? Any fancy AI or algorithms or sentiment analysis?
Highlighter.
Cool.
In compiling the top 5, we focused on those that were mentioned by the most guests, and themes where each person who mentioned them came at the theme from a slightly different and interesting angle. So there were quite a few that, though they came up repeatedly, didn't quite make the cut using those criteria. Themes like AI, learning transfer, data analytics, gamification, self-directed learning.
Given the time of year, Jay, perhaps we ought to call that elf-directed learning.
I am not an elf, and I am not going to do any learning because it sucks.
Anyway, we boiled the list down to 5 themes that just seemed to dominate and which people seem to have the most interesting things to say about. So, in 5th place, everyone was talking about the learner experience.
I got very interested in a different way of talking about learning design that I've heard over the past few years. Instead of instructional designers, it seemed we now had learning experience designers instead of learning management systems, or as well as learning experience platforms. The experience word was everywhere. What was going on? I tracked down Connie Malamed, a distinguished instructional designer who's been around for a while, at the Learning Technologies exhibition, and asked her why she had picked up on it.
The reason I think that the terminology change is good is because I think that learning experience design means you're not necessarily designing a course. It could be that you're designing anything that will help people improve performance, and it takes into account user experience design and borrows from a lot of different fields. So that's how I see the difference between the two, whereas instructional design is more of a practice to get at that analysis. In learning experience design, it's a little more wide open. We can do design thinking, we can do user experience tools, we can also use instructional design best practices.
Connie is also a fan of design thinking, which has become a popular part of the Learning Experience Designer's Toolkit. Andrea Myles of Best at Digital likes it too, and explained how design thinking helps her team focus on the needs of the learner.
It really is about understanding your audience. That's critical when it comes to learning, particularly when we're talking about changing behaviours. It's not just about what they need to know, it's what we would love them to do, and we need to understand, what might get in the way of that.
How did Nick Shackleton-Jones see the change?
I'll put this in very practical terms. When I was at BP, nobody had ever talked, to people actually doing real jobs on the front line, so to speak. Instead, we had all these kind of academies. But we did this radical thing of actually talking to people who are working in a refinery and getting their perspective on, what training was there to do. And to them, it's like rain or hail. It's just this constant, stuff that it makes the job more difficult. It's raining down on them from the HR folk. It's like, oh, you've got to do another compliance thing. That's not exclusively people's experience of L&D, but I think the insight that we brought to that organisation and are now bringing to kind of others is, why don't you actually start, instead of starting with the systems and the content and saying we are going to use this system to push out all this content at people, actually understand what somebody's experience is at a quite granular level. Like, you come to work, you're trying to do this, you're struggling with this, and then this is what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day, and then actually develop learning and other stuff which kind of supports them in doing that thing, and that's how you achieve business alignment, by helping people to do their jobs. And that, I think, is an idea that sort of bubbled up through development, and through the idea that user experience is where you should focus, not just on the kind of the back end of the systems. What I don't like about it is we should just be talking about people's experience, not their learning experience.
But while the shift from a fundamentally administrative mindset to one more focused on the learner has to be good for learning tech, many saw dangers in the trend. Here's Leonard Houx.
This idea of learning experience taps into a kind of fundamental misconception we have about education, which is that it's something intuitive and it's something transparent to us. Wanting to be fair to UX, especially usability engineering, is about removing difficulty, or was it Stephen Krug wrote the book Don't Make Me Think.
Yeah.
What we're really trying to do is not make things easier, not remove thought for people, but actually to make things more difficult. So you could argue that actually usability and UX is the most important in learning, because we are going to ask people to do difficult things, and so we need to make everything else perfect. And you can also use UX to build focus.
This new focus on the learner experience hasn't only affected design, it's also affected the technology systems we use to deliver learner experiences online. Here's Danny Johnson of US Analysts Red Thread.
It's not a one-size-fits-all anymore, and organizations are getting much better at determining what kind of experience they want to offer and finding the technology to do that, versus adapting a platform experience and having to also adapt the mindset that platform was built on.
With his company Fuse, Steve Dineen has been a pioneer in a new category of learning systems that Josh Bursin christened learning experience platforms.
I'm not overly keen with the term LXP, because I think, when we first started talking about learning experiences, I think our definition of a learning experience has been somewhat changed to what our vision of that was. For us, a learning experience was, how do you create an holistic experience that achieves the business impact for a particular audience? And recognizing that inside a platform, we recognize these different audiences need different experiences.
But like every other trend in learning, the LXP has its detractors.
What's fascinating to me is this sense of learning experience platform is, in my view, significantly overblown, right? And it, in some ways, sets everybody up to be significantly disappointed
David Perring is one of the principal analysts at Fosway, a company that has consistently been sceptical about the learning experience platform as a category. When lockdown struck, LXPs seemed to receive a PR boost when Fosway's own research reported that 48% of learning professionals interviewed said that LXP had been most successful in supporting them during the crisis, as opposed to only 29% for LMS. I asked the other David in Fosway, David Wilson, whether this might have prompted a rethink.
I think it's fair to say you've been a bit of a sceptic as far as LXPs are concerned. The figures here seem to show that that has been quite widely adopted, in fact. And clearly the crisis has accelerated change in our industry to a degree. Will the way this research has turned out change the way that you view the platform market at all, you think?
No.
To be fair to analysts, they had to try and explain the learning systems market to buyers who are massively confused by these categories. Here's Danny Johnson of Red Thread.
And it's really frustrating to everybody, the vendors, the small vendors, the large vendors, and the leaders in organizations when we try and divide things up into LMSs, LXPs, etc. We actually have to, I think we have to granularize even further and look at the functionalities that they offer and to truly build an ecosystem that works for us.
I think there's no doubt it's confusing, right? So there's no doubt that there's lots of terminologies and lots of language, and the fact that the analysts don't agree on one set of terms makes it really hard, I think, both for the buyer and for the vendors.
And it's no easier for consultants who are supporting their clients in trying to make good buying decisions, such as Lee-Gibbs of LearnFox.
There is a huge blurring of the boundaries between what an LMS is and what an LXP is.
So what do the vendors say? Paul McElvaney of Learning Pool, full disclosure, Learning Pool sponsors the podcast, is sticking to his guns.
There's quite a bit of chat about where, what's an LXP versus an LMS and stuff like that. And, I think, to be honest, it's probably something that analysts in the market are more interested in than buyers. If you strip back the hype around the LXP, I think what you can see is that there's a response to customer demand here, which is about a learning experience that is more consumer grade, more integrated with a changing workflow, and more personalised to the context either of the user, the business, or some other criteria.
Those vendors who are passionate about the LXP systems they built will continue to insist that there is a fundamental shift in the design philosophy that differentiates them from the LMS, like Steve Dineen.
People like us, we designed our platform and architecture from the experience upwards rather than maybe the LMS vendors, which is record keeping downwards.
I think the winners will be the people who have rethought that from the ground up. Mm-hmm. And I think the losers will be the people who have tried to repackage an old tech stack to look a bit like an LXP.
The fourth most talked about theme on the podcast was learning in the flow of work.
When I started the podcast, I really had a problem with this topic in that I couldn't work out in my own mind what it was really about. So to be fair, if my guests talked about it a lot, that could be just because I asked about it a lot, and several guests brought it up without any prompting. In an early episode of the podcast, Nick Shackleton-Jones gave me a balanced view of learning in the flow of work that began to clear the fog for me.
I think there's a good sense of learning in the flow of work and a bad sense. And so you will have seen me kind of battling things like micro-learning, which I think is the bad sense of it, and promoting the good sense, which is performance support. And let me just kind of draw the distinction there. So I think almost all learning happens in the flow of work, which is kind of jargon. I think that's what 70-20-10 and other more reliable bits of research is really about, that the vast majority of learning is happening as we're doing stuff. I think that the way that it's been misinterpreted is we should force people to learn as they're working. So let's take all of the content that we couldn't get them to consume as lectures because it was too costly, and we couldn't get them to consume as e-learning because they hated it. Let's chop it up into ever small pieces so that if they've got an odd 2 minutes, while they're not doing something else, then they can do this module. And I think that's a terrible idea.
Jane Hart reinforced this sense that here was a term that, though it stood for an idea which might be good in principle, was being used in rather loose and misleading ways.
And what I've seen a lot of learning the flow of work is actually training people at the desktop.
Paul Matthews was an enthusiast, however.
The closer we can bring the learning to where it's being used, the more effective typically it will be.
Paul wrote a book about learning transfer, and he thinks the whole learning in workflow thing is very helpful for getting L&D to focus on activities that will have more of an impact on workplace performance.
Well, learning in the flow of work actually is best for learning transfer. I mean, the learning transfer happens by and large as a result of the things that people do and what they learn from what they do after they start applying some learning. So it's that practice and experimentation. So it's the informal aspects of learning in that case that start engendering and enabling people to start using learning in an effective way in the workflow.
Of course, there's a technology dimension to this too, and for some people, that's all about bots.
Everybody loves a robot.
Despite all the hype about LearnBots, they're actually having positive effects, it seems, in bringing learning into the workflow. Hype was not what motivated Henrietta Palmer when she developed her award-winning AI LearnBot for TUI.
Well, it was never about doing something cool and new and interesting. It was about finding the right solution to a problem. Although I have to say, when people ask me what I do try and throw in AI because it makes me sound a little bit more interesting than I am.
And the rise of workplace comms platforms like Slack and Teams has given L&D places from which to launch their bots, so to speak, as well as other types of learning technology, a trend that's been accelerated by the pandemic. As Myles Runham notes,
I think there's an introduction of tools into the workplace now which people are using for getting to grips with in their own ways, and Microsoft Teams is probably the most obvious poster child for this, where Teams has arrived in lots of organizations as a very powerful and very well configured and designed toolkit that allows people to communicate, collaborate, and share content and share ideas and organize themselves. And I think there's a great opportunity there that some of the technology adoption challenges that the learning and development world has encountered, famously with the LMS, I suppose, perhaps the arrival of some of these tools and technologies necessitated by our COVID lockdowns have overcome some of those barriers. And I think that I'm quite hopeful about that. I think that's quite interesting.
Of course, learning in workflow is not really a new idea. Academics Victoria Marsick and Susan E. Watkins have been working together for more than 30 years and have been talking for some time about how learning is gradually growing closer to the working situation.
In some ways, we started out by looking at, to what extent was learning mostly separate from work, and how has it moved increasingly towards work, so that we have things, for example, like we were calling it coterminous work, and seamlessly integrated. I know some organizations call it learning in the workflow, or performance adjacent work, performance adjacent learning. So you have those kinds of things, but at the same time, you also have this shift in the new learning that's infused in it. And we also started talking about the fact that as you do that, you're also moving from mostly looking at the learning of individuals to learning of more like systems, teams, networks, organizations, because much work gets done now across boundaries and in networks and in fluid kinds of groups. And so how do people learn to do that?
So learning in the flow of work, in Victoria's view, leads necessarily to more of a focus on the team, the group, and what we might call collective intelligence. Hold that thought. We're going to revisit it.
Experience.
It's everything that ever happened to you, everything that ever will. Experiences, both huge and not so huge, slowly add up over a lifetime to become your experience. Everything you know, everything you are.
Experience.
And now the experience word is taking over learning.
Learning experience.
Our learning experience.
Learning experience design.
Learning experiences.
And some worry that the change will distract from what science has told us about how people learn. Do we even know what we mean by the words learning experience? Is this a learning experience? Or this? Or this? I've talked to some incredibly smart designers, theoreticians, L&D practitioners and technologists on behalf of the good people at Learning Pool. And together we've created a series of guides and resources to help you get the best from this change. Download the first of these now, the Experience White Paper.
Experience.
So, for theme number 3, Women in Learning.
Is this where you mansplain feminism, John?
Jay is going to introduce this one.
Thank you. Learning has a real gender diversity problem.
Here's the news. Research shows female L&D professionals face serious obstacles to career progress, and the problem hasn't improved in recent years.
In 2018, we got the numbers, and they got worse.
Meanwhile, the global pandemic is disproportionately affecting women, forcing many to consider leaving the job market altogether.
New research that our guest Gianni Giacomelli pointed us towards is showing how counterproductive this situation really is.
Hack facts.
A study by McKinsey found that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity on their executive teams were 21% more likely to experience above average profitability. In fields from software development to venture capital, a growing body of research is showing more diverse teams get better results. Research from Carnegie Mellon showed little correlation between a group's collective intelligence and the IQs of its individual members. But if a group includes more women, its collective intelligence rises. According to Dr. Anita Williams-Woolley of Carnegie Mellon, one of the authors of the report, this finding can be explained by differences in social sensitivity, on which studies have shown women score higher than men.
And there's something even more interesting in the research Gianni pointed us towards that we didn't have space to feature in the podcast. Teams that are majority female score consistently above average for collective intelligence, and they keep on getting smarter as you add more women to the team and subtract men, until you reach the point where there's only one man. That's the peak. After that, well, all women teams don't do so well. You need a man, but perhaps only one.
You're a token, Helmer.
At the Learning Technologies Conference back in February 2020, I ran into Caroline Ford of AstraZeneca, who was raving about a session she had just attended on women in learning.
Yeah, oh my God, I absolutely loved this session. I loved it. And it was just so great. The lady that delivered the session was Sharon Claffey. And she is just phenomenal. I have to get her name right because it's Sharon Kaliouby. And she was just absolutely marvellous.
So we invited Sharon onto the podcast to give her advice for the women and men who are working to change this fairly dire situation.
First off, think about how they're creating their own elevator, developing others, bringing others into the fold. Start talking about it. Don't feel as though, if anything, and there's still women out there in business and in learning and development that think it's just them. They see so many female managers or frontline workers, frontline managers like that, all being women. They figure they're not making it to the top because they're not good enough. And I will say, had I not invested time in multiple awards and educating myself on what great looks like, I would feel like I'm not good enough. I can't do it. It's not like 1 + 1, synergistically equals greater than 2. This really takes time to build confidence, understanding in yourself, reaching out to others. There's a hashtag Women in Learning LinkedIn group that just gets more conversation. Reach out to folks like myself or other thought leaders in the industry to figure out where, what, when, and how. Remember that men as your allies will definitely be a great step, and don't be too shy to, and if you get knocked down by people, just pick yourself up. That's the resilience and the grit it's going to take. Make sure you're doing something, whether it be learning or not, that you're passionate about. I forget, there was a great quote, I always mess them up, but like, you can end up doing a career in anything. So why not make it one that you love and that you're passionate about? If you're going to succeed or fail, you might as well do it in something that means the most to you. If you are passionate about learning, don't let anyone anyone tell you that you're not good enough or that you can't do it.
Andrea Myles of Best at Digital, a woman who has taken leadership roles in many male-dominated executive teams, gave this moving exhortation.
Always, regardless of gender in some respects, always believe that you can get there, because you can. Even if I didn't come with the traditional MBA qualification because I came through a design background. So I might not have been the most natural choice to be on an executive team, but I learned on the job and I had to learn hard to kind of earn my ropes to sit at the table. So I think, keep learning. Don't see your gender as a reason why not. Almost embrace it and see it as a reason why too. I remember a colleague of mine once saying to me, our conversations are far better when you're in the room, Andrea, not because of any other reason than I represented a group in our organisation that weren't represented at the table.
In the number 2 slot,
we have evidence-based design.
Everybody wants to get evidence-based now, it seems, and learning theory has really come to the fore. But which bit of learning theory? There's so much of it, and it conflicts. Instructional design guru Leonard Houx gave me a reading list.
Who are the people that we should be reading? I'd say Dave M. Merrill is a really important person. Gagne for me, is still really important. Siegfried Engelmann described what he did as instructional design, even though he's not counted among instructional designers. Reigeluth. However, and I guess in more kind of current times, Paul Sweller, Kirshner, Marienbohr, these are people who describe their work as instructional design and tie their work to the discourse, to the history of instructional design.
If I'm going to characterise in very broad terms where the influence of learning theory is strongest among theoreticians and practitioners right now, it's insights from cognitive psychology in the literature that dominate, as far as I can see. And this is complemented by a strong interest in neuroscience, a field that's seen real progression over the last couple of decades. Julliette Denny from Growth Engineering was just one of our guests who showed this influence, talking about the importance of the limbic brain.
It's the things that we can't stop feeling, basically. So it's things like love, competition, collaboration, the need for belonging. It's all of those kind of things. And most learning appeals to a neocortex level of so we have to do health and safety because it's what we're required to do, which doesn't really inspire us to do something.
Of course, along with all the good ideas that come from theory, there are also zombie ideas that just won't die. Learning styles, Myers-Briggs, the stuff with no foundation in research, the snake oil, the fake news of learning theory. I asked Leonard Houx why it is that new entrants to the space seem to get infected so easily. And this was the analogy he drew.
Yeah, it's a bit like they say that, like when you go to, your first day in university, or like if you join the armed forces, whoever the first people that talk to you are, the people like you are going to spend the rest of your time like never wanting to speak to again.
Freshers Week.
Yeah, and Freshers Week.
We were lucky enough to have on the podcast a real learning guru and significant contributor to the literature of learning theory, George Siemens, who gave us a definition of that very powerful ism of which he, along with Stephen Downes, was the parent, connectivism.
And the short definition of connectivism essentially is, that knowledge is networked and learning is the process of growing and pruning those networks. Those networks exist at 3 levels. One, which is beyond the scope of my but current place and capability, is around the neuroscience, and namely the biological basis of learning. It's literally connections and neurons developing. The second level is conceptual, and this is in the domain of cognitive science. And these are cognitive processes and the activities that we engage in when we play with ideas. And the third level at which learning is networked is what we'll call sort of the social or external level. That's increasingly where we rely on other people and we engage with other people. Now, obviously, these are all linked, if you have a new concept or idea, it's rendered in a biological basis in your brain. These new concepts or ideas are shaped and developed through your interactions with other people in your social network. So that's sort of the general concept of what connectivism is.
It's an idea that I heard echoed by Gianni Giacomelli in his chat on collective intelligence.
There's quite a lot of science that shows that intelligence is an emergent property of a network.
But as much as everyone should applaud the desire for the profession to root its practice in empirical observation and academic rigour, even the most theory-literate people have to admit a space for creativity.
If you read, for example, the first edition early work of Diana Lorillard and her inaugural work, Rethinking, I think it's Rethinking Higher Education, she presents Gagne in the worst possible light. In a way, her main objection is he's just making it up. This like the events of instruction, he's just made up a model. He just invented it. But I think that the kind of the punchline is that's what design is. Yeah. Design is making things up based on the best information that you have.
One further thing that has to be factored in is that there doesn't seem to be 100% agreement about what this word we're all obsessing over so much, learning, actually means.
The word learning itself is very confusing and very confused. I think for many people, they still equate it with training or education, or at least learning from being taught, and they don't see that learning as a much wider thing that can happen in many different ways.
I think learning, though, is an inadequate word for what it is that we do today.
But there's one theme that dominated the podcast above all from early spring this year onwards, just as it has dominated all our lives, the global pandemic.
Probably nobody we spoke to this year was closer to the reality of the pandemic whose effects were being felt on a scale unprecedented in the modern world than Reda Sadki. Reda is a friend of the podcast and works with frontline workers across multiple geographies on knowledge sharing about how best to combat infectious diseases. If you want to put it crudely, his day job is using learning to battle disease.
So if you take the Ebola crisis response, there were literally thousands of lessons learned, exercises. Every organization ran one. There were major, scientific publications that sort of synthesized and did the meta-analyses of all the lessons learned from the 2014-2015 Ebola crisis in the 3 affected countries. There's stuff ongoing now with the Ebola virus disease response in DRC, for example. Strangely, so far, I've spoken in the last couple of days with several people who feel that those lessons are being ignored. And there's actually another dimension, which is that, in fact, people in countries outside of Europe and North America, in some countries, have significant experience in epidemic response. The countries that were first hit after China do not. And to my knowledge, there's been very little, if anything, to learn from those experiences. In practice. And that's actually one of the things we are hoping to do in the coming weeks, is to bring together the people, the practitioners and managers from, who have that Ebola virus disease response experience, and to connect the dots between what is happening now. But what's amazing is in countries like Uganda, Rwanda, and a few others that shared borders with countries that are being hard hit by Ebola, a lot of the practices are already in place. Understanding what prevention measures look like, from hand washing to PPE, is already well ingrained for basically most of the health workers in the country. Have already gone through that process in a way similar, but with fewer resources than, say, the folks in Hong Kong or people who faced the SARS epidemic.
Reda's experience in a field where learning is not a tiresome chore to be endured so that your company can remain compliant, but literally a matter of life and death, carried out sometimes in really extreme conditions, gives him a broader perspective, I've felt, on the role of learning.
We live in a hyper-connected world, and if as an organization, for example, as a L&D manager, you're asking yourself, what is your role? What can you do in a crisis like this one? if your job is reduced to people asking you to help them set up a Zoom webinar or how to do their classroom training in a digital format, I think you are underestimating the potential of learning and development, the potential of and the potential role that you can have for your organization. And that's a perspective we took with respect to our work on immunization. In a way, we were initially asked, can you just do a training? And yes, the newness of it was that it was going to be done digital. Now, this was way before COVID, and we're a purely digital outfit. But once we did that, we realized that there was a lot that was gained from people making connections, being connected to each other. And there's a huge amount of work, there's George Siemens, theory of connectivism. There's, there's the work around communities of practice. I mean, for about 30 years, people in learning and development have been trying to figure out what to do, what that means for our roles, what that means for what we can actually provide to organizations.
It might sound ghoulish to say this, but while the pandemic is clearly bad for humanity and the economy, it's been a shot in the arm for the LearnTech industry, as overnight pretty much all training migrated online.
The coronavirus is a horrible, horrible thing. And it's devastating to pretty much every aspect of our lives. But I think it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of it when it comes to learning and development in the way that we run our organizations.
One immediate effect of lockdown was that uptake of online learning surged. Almost everyone I spoke to in spring 2020 was experiencing an uptick.
And it was very obvious that with people home working, pretty much the digital delivery was the only game in town. And therefore, we were seeing a huge spike in activity levels.
It seems that the pandemic was accelerating development of the whole field.
We could be at this for another 12 to 24 months. And if that's the case, then the reality is we will have massively increased our capability for interacting in digital networked environments.
And perhaps even those corners of the field that have been previously bogged down and unproductive, such as learning analytics.
I think the experience we are in right now is the necessary condition for corporate learning analytics over the next several years to take off enormously, simply because you have a quality and a type of data about individual capabilities and performance within an organization that we didn't have before. And that process isn't at all unlike what we saw happening with the educational field, where initially it was the online learning schools or distance education schools in 2008, 2009, 2010 that were getting these rich sources of data from student interaction in the learning management system that drove that interest. Then open online courses like Coursera, edX, and others came along, and it just blew it up. And all of a sudden you had Harvard, MIT, and a lot of computer scientists from top systems paying attention to learning data that they didn't have before. All those interactions used to be ephemeral in a classroom. Now they could see it, they could work with it, and they could use it to understand learning.
Donald Clark seemed to agree.
Data, it's absolutely, we're sitting in the middle of a coronavirus situation here. Mm-hmm. And let's not imagine that we're going to get out of this other than by looking at the data.
Analysts Fosway dropped a really significant piece of research into the effect of the crisis on L&D during the year that showed, among other things, an increase in agility.
The biggest thing that I think COVID has done, beyond any doubt, is made L&D much more agile. It's done things in days and weeks that it was taking months and years to do before. And I think can you bottle some of that so that you can keep being agile going forward?
Leadership expert Matthew Confer concurred.
It's incredible to me how fast people spun up alternative plans that reflected a world that they never could have imagined 3 to 4 months ago. So I think agility and ability to adapt to a world that you maybe never could have imagined has set some people apart in the decision-making realm.
But will we all just go back to normal when the crisis is over?
And I think the question then is, will the genie go back in the bottle, right? So will we go back to that? And I think that's a really, really, really interesting. So that, we're seeing is nearly 70% of companies saying definitively no, having made this shift, that the strategy going forward will not go back to what it what it was like before, the mix and so on and things like this. So I think the dam's broken.
What do you say, Paul Matthews?
Of all the people I talk to, there's nobody that I would rate has said anything more than 50% of face-to-face training will ever come back.
At the time of recording, with vaccines approved and vaccination actually underway, the future looks a whole lot brighter. So there you have it, the themes that rocked our world in the first 30 episodes of The Learning Hack. What will emerge from the next 30? Well, the really exciting thing is, I don't know.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to all our guests over the last year and a half and to our sponsors Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
And don't forget to leave a review and a 5-star rating if you want other people to find us as well. You can tweet me at John Helmer or reach me through my website johnhelmerconsulting.com.
We'll be taking a much needed break now for the holidays.
But we'll be back in January with a whole new load of guests, facts
and themes.
Until then, have a great holiday. Get on up, stay on the scene, stay safe, and above all,
stay classy, learning people.
Now I finally get it.
Just as at the fourth most talked about topic on the the fourth. No, I've lost it now, John. It's gone completely. Happy Christmas.